Hi, everyone, and welcome. If you do not know me, my name is Ruth Zachrin, and I am always honored to be able to say that I am the CEO of the Massachusetts Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. I want to welcome you to our August Lunch and Learn with our friend John Lindsay-Poland, who we'll be hearing a lot more about in a moment. Just a couple of housekeeping issues. As I mentioned before, we are recording today's presentation. We have many folks who are not able to join us but wanted to get the recording. So we are going to make that available to folks afterwards. We also just ask that you keep yourself on mute until we get to the question and answer period. We'll be inviting folks to come off of mute at that point if they would like to ask a question. And if you do have any questions while the presentation is happening, you can also feel free to put your questions in the chat. So glad that you could all be here with us today. And just to set the stage a bit for today's Lunch and Learn program, this is something that we have been talking about at the Coalition and with John Lindsay-Poland for quite a while. The connection between US guns, the impact on immigration, and the way that this all connects to Massachusetts is pretty significant. And I'll share with you that as we were preparing for today's program, I did have someone ask me why we were having this particular topic, as it's a little bit different than what the coalition typically talks about in their minds, because we usually very much focus on how gun violence shows up in Massachusetts. But in fact, as you'll learn today, this has a deep Massachusetts connection, both in terms of Massachusetts guns that show up in other countries, as well as how guns drive migration that then impacts Massachusetts. So today really is about connecting so many of those dots and bringing those pieces together so that we can learn together with someone who has a great deal of expertise on this topic, how all of those connections happen, the role that Massachusetts plays in this conversation, and what the ongoing work looks like for us in Massachusetts for the coalition, and really thinking about the larger impact of guns outside of this country. And also just to set the stage, and it's something that has really resonated with me as I think about the issue of immigration and how that is playing out here in the Massachusetts. I think very often about a poem called Home by an author named Warsan Shire. It's something I can share with folks afterwards. And the poem opens with a line that no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. And the image that comes up for me all the time is as we think about the mouth of that shark, those very sharp teeth are United States guns that are definitely driving the violence that cause people to flee and seek safety in other shores. And so, with that as the backdrop and a little bit of the context setting for why we are here today, again, I'm so glad you're able to join us. So glad that John Lindsay-Poland is able to join us. And right now, I want to turn it over to our terrific community organizer, Giovanna Rodriguez. Giovanna?
Thank you, Root. As a proud Chicana growing up in a very diverse city back in Texas, the immigrant community and migration has always been something that has been a part of my life. So as I joined the coalition and was able to bridge and learn more about this intersection between migration and gun violence across the border is something that I've been very much engaging and wanting to share with everyone. Since I started my work with the coalition last November, I've been attending binational meetings in which John is also a part of. And it's really in groups with different gun violence prevention groups across Mexico and the United States. And I've been learning a lot about the efforts that happen to end gun violence. And I'm very happy to be able to introduce John into this space. John co-directs the California Healing Justice Program of the American Friends Service Committee and coordinates the Stop U.S. Arms to Mexico project of global exchange. He has written about research and advocated for human rights and demilitarization of U.S. policy for more than 40 years. His research has focused on the gun trade, police militarization, and U.S. foreign military assistance and military bases and respect for human rights. John has produced several reports and a documentary on the devastating weapons trade from the United States to Mexico, and most recently, the Iron River of Weapons to Mexico, its sources and contents, and No Shelter from the Storm, update on the Iron River. As a reminder, John will present and then we'll follow up with some prepared questions and then opening it up to any questions from in the chat. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'll pass it over to John.
Thank you so much, Ruth and Giovanna, for organizing this. Thank you all for taking time on a summer day to enter into a subject that is not it's not easy. It's not an easy subject either. Ruth referenced how sometimes people can't quite connect it to our lives, but it's also not easy in the sense that the violence in Mexico is hard. It's painful. Um, so I'm thankful to you all because I do think there is a strong connection and there's something that all of us, each of us, can do. So I'll share information. I'm gonna show some images and slides. I hope that we'll have plenty of time for conversation and questions. Feel free to either save those or put them in the chat. Um, because I often feel like that's where we really learn and we really begin to make a difference is when we actually engage something and not just receive information. Um, so let me just share what I've got here and pull this up. Okay. Um, so I coordinate this project called Stop U.S. Arms to Mexico, which really began in 2012 when I was part of a cross-country caravan of Mexican victims of gun violence, mostly family members of people who had been forcibly disappeared, and just was very moved by their experiences and felt like I could do some research and begin to at least show how the ways in which the U.S. gun market impacts Mexico. Um, so this is someone who lives in New York, Antonio Tizapa. His son, Jorge Antonio, was one of 43 students who was forcibly disappeared in 2014. And Don Antonio couldn't go back. And so he began to run. He's a runner. And so uh, that's what he could do, is he could join with other runners in New York, but he runs in the Boston Marathon every year. And so we got together and went to Washington, and he just began to speak about how U.S. weapons that were involved. There were cult weapons that were being used by the local police who were involved in the forcible disappearance of those students. And and said, if you were in my place, I think you would be doing the same thing I'm doing. Um, so I don't know if any of you have been directly impacted by gun violence, but one thing I often share with people is that a gun that is purchased in the United States has about as much chance of being used in a homicide in Mexico as in a homicide in the United States. So we can't really think about the US gun market and its impacts and gun policy and all the different things that we want to do to control gun violence and reduce it and prevent it without considering the impact that they have across the border in Mexico and beyond. So here is uh, just in numbers, over the last 20 years, the number of gun homicides in Mexico. And there's some key points here. Um, One is that the drug war was declared in 2007 and 8 with US support by both Mexico and the United States, in which the military was deployed in Mexico, again with US support. And you have this first big increase in gun homicides as the drug war is unleashed. It plateaus, even goes down a little bit, and then continues to go up. There's a number of different reasons for that. But one of the other things here is that the US assault weapons ban expired in 2004, and the number of U.S. assault weapons that go over the border begins to increase and continues to increase. Now, the number of gun homicides in Mexico over the last few years has gone down modestly, as you can see, nowhere near what it was 20 years ago. And sometimes that's the Mexican government trumpets that as a great success. But in fact, forced disappearances have increased and have nullified any kind of decrease in gun homicides. So the just the amount of gun violence is just enormous and is not really gone down. Um, and so it's constantly in the awareness of people in Mexico. It's constantly, everybody knows somebody who's been directly impacted. You might think of this as, oh, it's drug cartels fighting each other or fighting the government, but in fact, it affects everyone because there's many different types of gun violence in Mexico. In addition to homicides and forced disappearances, the migrant trade is controlled by organized crime, and so guns are involved in that. Um, the extortion of people is extensive, kidnapping of people for ransom, uh, sexual violence using firearms. The number of women impacted by gun violence in Mexico has increased dramatically because there's more guns in the home, including guns that are owned by members of criminal organizations. Um, it's just constantly there. So let's look at the U.S. gun market. Now, this is a map we obtained data through a Freedom of Information Act request that was turned down by the ATF, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. And then we went to court and got the information. And this is the number of firearms over this 8-year period that were recovered in Mexico or Honduras, El Salvador, or Guatemala by the zip code at which it was purchased in the United States. And in fact, Massachusetts is not a major source of purchased firearms to traffic to Mexico. Um, but there is, it's all over really, right? As you can see from this map, there are concentrations. And so in southern Texas and in Arizona, for example, there are high concentrations of firearms. We've been able to map this. You can see this on our site. So there's, Harlingen, Texas is not a big town. Um, I think the population is around 70 or 80,000. Um, but it has, uh, many firearms being trafficked from there and many gun shops as well. So, and it's right on the border. And so you can see this concentration here, as well as in big towns in Texas. It's important that Massachusetts maintain its firearms laws, in part because you can see the difference. There's a distance from the border, but there's also the difference in gun laws between Texas and Arizona and Massachusetts and other New England states in terms of the number of firearms that are trafficked because it is so easy to purchase a firearm, which we'll see in just a moment. Now, there's also a large number of firearms being trafficked to Haiti. There is there's a ban on legally exported firearms to Haiti, but there are many firearms that are trafficked to other Caribbean countries and then smuggled to Haiti, or they are exported to other Caribbean countries and then trafficked to Haiti. This just shows within Florida uh, and to some extent in the Atlanta area of Georgia that there's a large number of firearms that are traced back to gun shops, purchases at gun shops across Florida. And you can see there's a special concentration in the Miami area. So a lot of these are purchased in these in shops here in the Miami area, and then they are trafficked aboard container ships which go down the Miami River and go to one of the Caribbean countries, and from there are then smuggled on. So you can see Bahamas is a critical point at which many of the guns are recovered, as well as Jamaica. There's very little tracing from Haiti because there's almost no police functioning to recover firearms. But we know from UN and other reports that US sourced firearms, especially assault weapons that are purchased in Florida, are the primary source of the criminal gangs that are now running a good part of Haiti and forcing more and more people to seek refuge. Um, so for the Haitian population in Massachusetts and in other parts of the United States, this is a key reason why people have had to flee and continue to have to flee. So Arizona, as I said, is also a key source of firearms being trafficked to Mexico. We just last week obtained new data that shows what's called the time to crime by zip code. So when a firearm is recovered within a relatively short period, within a year, for example, after its purchase, it is highly likely that that firearm was purchased in order to traffic it, in this case, over the border. And so when we look at the short time to crime weapons recovered in Mexico over the last 2 years, particularly, Arizona is clearly the hotspot for buying weapons to traffic over the border. The data that we got last week shows the zip code of purchase by the time to crime. And for those that were less than a year, the top 15 zip codes where they were purchased, 12 of them are in Arizona. So you can see that it is now a preferred location for the retail part of this illegal business. Um, it's also important to note, I said that there aren't that many weapons that are traced back to Massachusetts, but any number of weapons that are traced back are only a fraction of those that have actually been trafficked. So this shows the left bar shows the number of firearms that were recovered in Mexico and submitted for tracing in 2022. Um, of those, the red shows they were U.S. sourced, and that they might be because of the make. Maybe they were made by Smith and Wesson or Colt, um, or some other way that they were identified as coming from the United States. But the purchase location for those was only identified for about half of them. And then you can see of those, only a portion were investigated by the ATF as a criminal matter. And then compared to that, the number that are recovered on the US side by the Border Patrol that were on their way to Mexico is an even smaller number. Um, and so the US is a big part of this, and yet its efforts, the Trump administration is constantly criticizing Mexico for not doing enough against the cartels, and yet these weapons are going to the cartels, and the U.S. is doing very little to stop their flow. Um, Assault weapons are a very important piece of this. In the United States, even though assault weapons are very prominent in mass shootings, and we see a lot of attention to them. There is a majority of people in the United States who favor a federal ban on assault weapons, but they're actually a small portion of crime guns that are recovered, about between 5 and 6%. Whereas in Mexico, it's more like 22, 23%. So they play a much bigger role in gun violence in Mexico than they do proportionally in the United States. And therefore, I often say the most important thing that the United States could do if it were politically attainable would be to ban assault rifles for purchase in the United States, because they play such a big role. Um, there are also um, weapons that are not that popular in the United States. This is a 50 caliber rifle. It is legal for purchase in Massachusetts. Um, and it can fire over a mile away accurately. The round is a huge round. It can go through a tank. It has in Mexico downed helicopter, a military helicopter, um, and it's easy to get. So I took this picture at a gun show in Texas in 2020, just before the pandemic started, and the guy selling it said he was an unlicensed seller, right? So in Texas, you do not need a license to sell firearms. And so he said, "Yeah, sure, you can buy it if you have the money. You can purchase it, and there would be no background check." Again, it is also legal to purchase in Massachusetts, and it has been trafficked to Mexico from as far away as Wisconsin. Um, and I'll get to this, but there is now proposed legislation to ban its sale in the United States. Um, this was the gun show where I saw this. Gun shows are um, places where you can buy a gun without a background check in most states. Um, you can also buy a gun without a background check through other private sales on the internet, in parking lots, in other ways. Um, and so it is, the federal legislation to require background checks universally for all purchases of guns is also an important piece to this. But what my point here is that they are very easily accessible for criminal organizations across the border. Now, some people say, okay, well, why doesn't the US or Mexico or both, why don't they, just check the border? And then people say, oh, well, the Border Patrol or the Mexican customs agents, they're corrupt. Well, there's a structural problem. And the structural problem is that both countries prioritize legal trade across their border. And for the same reason that drugs cross the border into the United States easily, there has been, the drug war to try to detain or reduce the flow across the border has had almost no impact on the supply of fentanyl and other drugs within the United States. For the same reason, it's very difficult structurally to use that as a strategy to stop firearms from going across the border. So that's why we say the strategies have to go upstream. They have to go to the production and sale of firearms and the regulation of the production and sale, in order to really have an impact. Because at the border, while it's fine to, try to stop firearms from crossing the border, it's a very limited strategy in its likely impacts. So, Smith& Wesson, located as you know, in Springfield, is the most commonly recovered crime gun in Mexico and Central America. In the last 10 years, more than 18,000 firearms were recovered in Mexico and Central America and identified as Smith& Wesson. Again, this is only a fraction of those that were actually trafficked, because most firearms that are trafficked across the border are never recovered. And even of those that are recovered, many are not traced. Sometimes that's because the serial number has been filed off, or not sufficient information has been given by Mexican authorities, or ATF doesn't prioritize it. But and I do want to note, even though this is a picture of a military grade Smith& Wesson weapon introduced in 2006, I believe, um, most Smith& weapons recovered are handguns, pistols and revolvers, the ones recovered in Mexico. Um, but there are also some of these assault rifles as well. So some of you are aware that in 2021, the government of Mexico sued Smith& Wesson and eight other gun manufacturers, depending on how you count them, within the United States for negligence in their marketing, production and marketing of firearms that end up being trafficked to Mexico. Um, they sued them for money, but they also sued them to change their practices, because the producers know that guns are being trafficked, and they could take measures to stop the flow of guns to dealers from which many of these weapons are being trafficked. But they have not done so. So this was initially dismissed by a judge in Boston. It was filed in Boston, initially dismissed by the lower court judge. Mexico appealed. The appellate court upheld Mexico, said it could go forward. The defendants appealed to the Supreme Court, and unfortunately, the Supreme Court accepted the case, even though the case had not advanced into discovery or the evidence phase, which could have produced a lot of information that would support Mexico's case, of what those companies know and how they proceed with their practices, even though what they know about trafficking. So the Supreme Court in June dismissed the case, and they based it on the National PLACA law, the Protection of Legal Commerce in Arms Act. Um, and so the PLACA law is a key defense of the gun companies. And I understand that in Massachusetts, you are working on a state law that would permit you to at least file lawsuits for harms done in Massachusetts against gun companies. That that would not extend to harms done in Mexico, but it's an important, a chink in the armor around the gun companies to state by state uh, bring these laws and overturn the state level LACAs. Um, so before I go to some stuff about the legal commerce, there's another lawsuit that is in Arizona against five gun dealers, and that lawsuit has proceeded. It is in the discovery phase. It has a much higher chance of being. It was not affected by the Supreme Court decision, and so it has a better chance of proceeding, because the gun companies are also closer to the nexus of trafficking and the harm done in Mexico. So I want to say a few words about legal exports. Um, the same graph that you saw earlier of the last 20 years of gun homicides and disappearances kind of tracks to also to legal exports. Mexico is by far the largest importer of U.S. firearms in Latin America, by far. And in fact, Mexico has a large portion of the global exports from Sig Sauer, which is located just over the border from you in New Hampshire. Um, and so a lot of that grows in 2007 after the drug war is declared. The Merida Initiative was the U.S. Sort of funding initiative that funded that drug war in Mexico, and stays high even though the amount of assistance went down. The exports continue to stay very high. And if we saw, this is only through 2023, but if we saw last year and even the first few months of this year, um, the United States continues to export a large number of military rifles to Mexico. A lot of these are from Colt in Connecticut, and I'll say a little bit more about that. So I'm sorry, in 2020, there was a very, very large purchase, more than 50,000 pistols from Sig Sauer that went to the National Guard, which had recently been created supposedly to fight organized crime. But in fact, most of the National Guard's mission within Mexico has been in response to the U.S. push to stop migrants from reaching the U.S.-Mexico border. So the National Guard has primarily been focused on detaining migrants from Central America, from Haiti, from other countries, Venezuela, African countries, and many more. Um, again, using US supplied firearms. So someone who is fleeing violence in their country, they come to Mexico, they can't stay in Mexico because it is dangerous for migrants. It's dangerous because of organized crime that get their weapons from over the border in the United States. And it's dangerous because of the state authorities that are also armed with US weapons who will detain them and return them to their countries where they have fled violence, often also from US guns. So the people who are migrating are trapped by US guns all around. And you have this kind of cocktail of toxic policies at the border where you have people who are not being allowed into the United States or being turned back into Mexico from the United States into territories that are controlled by organized crime, but also patrolled by state authorities who will detain them and deport them. This is just another measure of the military rifles that the United States has exported to Mexico. And you can see here is the 2024 figure. It's just grown an enormous amount. And compared to other countries that the US supplies that are in outright war, Mexico has actually been importing more military rifles than Israel or Ukraine, um, at least in the last year and a half, 2 years. Where are these weapons coming from? So I mentioned Colt, based in Hartford. We have obtained documentation showing that these weapons are going to police units in Mexico that are committing serious human rights abuses, even after those human rights abuses have been documented, acknowledged in the United States and Mexico. Here you can see cult weapons going to Guerrero State Police after the disappearance of the 43 students that I mentioned before. Um, and uh, yeah, and so Sig Sauer is also a major supplier of police in Mexico, including a special operations unit in Tamaulipas. That's the Mexican state right over the border from the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. Um, and those special forces police were involved in the massacre of 16 Guatemalan migrants just across the border in Camargo at the very beginning of Biden's term. Um, and yet, even after they were implicated in that, Sig Sauer again sold weapons to the same state police in Tamaulipas after that, several months after that. And one thing I just want to note is that this is an end use certificate that is required by the exporting company, in this case, Sig Sauer. But it is not sent to the US government. It is sent to, it's produced by the Mexican army, which imports all of these firearms. All firearms legally imported into Mexico are imported by the army and then distributed to police or a small number of private individuals. Um, but the end use certificate did not go to the US government, which theoretically could have permitted the US government to filter it out and deny the license. So this is just more documentation about more rifles, again from Sig Sauer in New Hampshire, going to that same state police unit in Tamaulipas. So what can we do? Um, there is legislation that is been introduced by Representative Joaquin Castro. Um, in Texas to called the Stop Arming Cartels Act. This would prohibit the sale of 50 caliber rifles. In Massachusetts, among House members, only Representative Auchincloss has co-signed this as a sponsor. And there's a Senate version as well, and Senator Warren is a co-sponsor. I have to say, Senator Warren has been very good on these issues. I can't say, Markey has not been so active. And Senator Warren is currently working on a letter to oppose the re-liberalization of firearms export controls by the Trump administration. Of course, approving a federal ban on assault weapons is not especially attainable right now. We also, although it would be impactful, and we also hope that in the House, the Armas Act will be reintroduced in the next couple months. This is legislation that would both create an interagency strategy on illicit trafficking, but also more centrally control the export of firearms to human rights violators. So what I just described in the end use certificates would be much reduced and controlled under that legislation. It's also really important for Mexico to continue these lawsuits, including the one in Arizona, and potentially introduce new ones. We're also proposing that Mexico use its influence as a major purchaser of firearms, uh, including with Colt and Smith and Wesson. They have purchased some. I'm sorry, Colt and Sig Sauer. They have purchased some from Smith and Wesson, less. Um, but to get those gun makers to commit to measures that would reduce gun trafficking from the U.S. This could be identifying dealers that have been problematic dealers, introducing some due diligence measures with their dealers and distributors in the United States in order to prevent trafficking. So I'm gonna pause here and see. Here's more information. I will gladly provide more information afterwards, but I'll pause here.
Thank you, John, for all of that presentation and all of that information. As I stated before, we're not going to transition over to the prepared questions that we have and then opening it up at the end to any Q&A that has been added in the chat. As our first prepared question, how did you get involved in this work, John?
So I referenced before that I was involved in a caravan that crossed the United States in 2012. And so really it was through meeting people who were impacted. And they would tell their stories about, it's not only the heartbreak, it's that those were individuals who said, maybe before this happened to me, I didn't think it was affected me. And then I realized, oh, I have to do something. Um, now they are if affected, and um, and so they just felt they had to speak up. And that's a very powerful, you realize that people who are some people who have been impacted by violence in Mexico, it's dangerous for them to speak up. There are collectives of family members, mostly women, who are looking for their relatives who have been forcibly disappeared. And some of them have been killed, right? People who have implicated not just cartels, but also government officials sometimes in these crimes, have themselves been targeted. So if they can speak up, I just thought, okay, I can too. I can put whatever skills I have to work. I'm a good researcher. I speak Spanish. I can do something. And I've spent several decades working against U.S. military intervention in Latin America. And as um, as I'm just seeing Bruce's question today, but what is your goal? Um, um, uh, as the violence in Mexico became much more of a mix of state violence and criminal organization violence, I saw how the trafficking of weapons and as well as the export of weapons is growing both of these things. It's growing state violence, but it's growing the cartel violence. And so really our gun market, our country's gun market is perfect for criminal organizations. It's excellent. And so I just felt that for those people who I've met and who I work with in Mexico who have decided to work against this, that I could find something to do too.
Thank you, John. Another question that we have is, you showed us all the different slides that really showcase a different timeline of different things. Overall, how have you seen your work or the work that you've done change over the years?
So when our project started in 2017, and nobody knew anything about this. Nobody talked about it. in Mexico or the US, really. I mean, people thought about drug cartel violence, but they thought about it in terms of drugs, right? They thought about maybe in terms of the drug war, maybe in terms of human rights, but not in terms of the way in which guns are vectors of this public health problem, right? Or the way in which the gun industry and the ways that guns empower all of these criminal enterprises in Mexico, as well as state violence. And now there's a lot more awareness. It's still a lot of people don't connect the dots. A lot of people don't know much about it, but the lawsuit introduced by Mexico in 2021 definitely had an impact. And so even though it was the one against the gun makers was thrown out by the Supreme Court, the impact on awareness has been substantial. And that's, to me, that was the most valuable part about it, is that people begin to understand that this is not just a Mexican problem. This is a problem, this is a US problem. And we have to think about it, frame it as the producers and the sellers are part of this. And so that's, I think, there's more of that. There's a bit more awareness too of the impact on migration as migration has been made a major issue in the United States. Um, that people get, more of a sense of like, oh, right, more people are not, they're not just trying to get jobs. They're not just fleeing poverty. They've been poor for a long time in most of these countries. There's a new thing, which is the violence that is coming from the guns. And so I think there are more people who are beginning to make that connection.
Thank you, John. I'm going to jump in with two other questions and we're going to open it up to the questions in the chat or other questions that folks have. John, earlier you referenced the ATF, and that's something that, as we think about what's happening on the national stage of the impact on Massachusetts, we've been paying very close attention to what's happening with the ATF. And I'm hoping you can expand a bit more about the role of the ATF in this conversation, both in terms of the trafficking, the research that you're doing, if you could touch on that.
Yeah. So the ATF has always been a very under-resourced agency, right, for the task in front of it, both to regulate firearms, but also as a law enforcement agency to investigate and bring cases of crimes with firearms. And now it's really on the verge of being dismantled, abolished. In June, so in Mexico, there are, I think it's 12 agents. And this is on a, in a problem where there's the most recent estimate is 135,000 firearms were trafficked from the US to Mexico in 2022. So the problem is just enormous for the scale of it is enormous for the size. When we were in Mexico City in June, we met with sort of the equivalent of the FBI. So their counterpart is FBI and ATF. And they said, "Oh yeah, we met with ATF this morning. They're still here, but they can't go out on operations." So all of the ways in which the ATF budget is being slashed are going to impact the ATF's ability first to track the weapons, right? It's already hamstrung in its ability to trace weapons because they can't keep computerized records of sales by law. Um, but that's going to be reduced even more as its budget is slashed. There will be fewer investigations. There will be fewer warnings. There was an investigation published in The Conversation in June that showed that one of the single most important measures to reduce gun dealers' sales of guns that are trafficked to Mexico is inspections and warning letters. And those are going to be greatly reduced as well. They were already very few. So the ways in which ATF is being dismantled as a so-called pro-Second Amendment measure is most likely going to accelerate the ability of criminal organizations to traffic guns over the border with ease. And really, that is we'll get to the ask question, what is the ask? But in terms of congressional representatives and even state officials, it's, I think, important to speak up about the importance of not dismantling the ATF. I say this as someone who is, not, I'm in favor of overall reducing the scope of policing. I also work on issues of police violence. But in the case of the ATF, I think it would be a huge mistake because otherwise then you have more private armies on either side of the border with no brakes, no guardrails.
Thank you for that. And we're going to do some more discussion about action steps at the end of the hour. But one more prepared question, and this is where I had a bit of a mind meld with Bruce's question in terms of like, what do you want folks to take away from this conversation? And I just want to jump in a little bit around some of the things that I'm so struck by in this. And one of the things you mentioned, connecting the dots. Um, it's a big part of the reason why we wanted to have this conversation. It's been in so many spaces where there's a discussion about immigration, where we're not talking about the role US guns, including guns that originate from right here in Massachusetts, are playing in that. So connecting those dots feels critically important. And it's just a big part of what we do with the coalition is to bring all these pieces together. And for us as an organization that does many things, including really focus on state policy, I'm also so struck by what you talked about in terms of states with stronger gun laws that provides protection to not just folks in those states, but it provides more protection around the trafficking of guns outside of the United States. So what we do here in Massachusetts to continue to move legislation forward, protect what we already have, is of critical importance both locally and well outside of Massachusetts as well. So I just want to share that those are two takeaways for me personally in this conversation, and how this all connects. But John, I'm wondering if you could just touch briefly on if there's what other things you want for folks who are here with us today to take away from this conversation.
Yeah. Well, I think it would be really important if the rest of the Massachusetts congressional delegation came on as co-sponsors of the Stop Arming Cartels Act. I don't see any reason why they wouldn't. Jim McGovern, Ayanna Pressley, the rest of the delegation, there's no reason why they shouldn't sign on as co-sponsors. Ayanna Pressley was just in Mexico City last week and heard a presentation about gun violence from some of our partners there. Um, so I think it would be important to contact them and say, it's important for you to do this. There's no reason why 50 caliber rifles should be legal in Massachusetts or anywhere else in the United States. Because, like these weapons, there's not even a place where you can practice with them because the range is so far. It's absurd. So they're really kind of built for in terms of the civilian market for these criminal groups. Um, I would also say that the awareness is a key piece to talk with people about it, to um, including in your if you're in community groups or gun violence prevention groups or groups that are looking at gun violence with a different lens, to bring that, to bring these lenses together. That is also really important. Um, the bill numbers for the Stop Arming Cartels Act, I will get those for you in just a second. I do have those.
And we can send out that information. We always do a follow-up after a lunch and learn with more information, and we can send all of that information out when we do so, as well as John's bio. I see Mark, our board president, asked that question in the chat too. But just to get to a couple of questions in the chat before we talk about our action steps, Dan asked if there are any other countries' guns that are showing up in Mexico and Central America in significant numbers.
So, of the firearms that are recovered in Mexico that are submitted for tracing, consistently 67 to 70% are US sourced. Of the remaining about 30%, about half, there is no, the country of source country is undetermined. So it's likely that of that other 15% or so, a good portion also come from the United States. So of that relatively smaller portion of 15% that are not US sourced, there are European country producer countries. There are some Chinese weapons. Those tend to be older. Um, there are some Brazilian weapons. There's Brazilian pistols that can come. Um, it's none of it is a large portion. In Central America, actually in Guatemala, a lot of weapons are imported into the country. You don't have this thing where the army controls the retail market within Guatemala like you do in Mexico. So they are private brokers, just like in the US, right? There's dealers in Guatemala who are importing weapons and then selling them on the market. And a lot of them are diverted. So a lot of the crime guns in Guatemala were legally imported, which is another reason why those export controls are really important because the United States can identify the Guatemalan importers that are problematic and not sell to them. Um, but there's no other country like the United States in terms of the source of weapons. By far, there's none.
Thank you. And I'm looking at the time, and we only have a few minutes left. And I did want to get to some action steps for all of us to take from this conversation. And one is assuredly raising awareness, connecting the dots, making sure that as folks are hearing and talking about the issue of immigration, that we are bringing up the role that guns play in those conversations, talking to folks about how our state gun laws and including all these federal pieces that John is talking about, we'll send that information out to everyone, keeps us safe here in the States and beyond, and making sure that people are taking that more holistic lens when we think about how guns and gun laws play out in this country. Um, and also very close to home, as John mentioned, we do have an industry accountability bill that we are working on here in Massachusetts that would touch on the PLACA issues that John brought up, holds the gun industry more accountable here in Massachusetts for improper practices that put people at risk, including the marketing piece that John mentioned before. We are going to have a week of action coming up in September, getting folks involved and pushing our state legislators to get this bill passed. It's an issue that we've been working on for a while, and we're doing a great deal of work with our national partners to make sure that we have this in place in Massachusetts. And as John mentioned before, it's another chink in the armor of the gun industry, and we should be able to make that happen here in Massachusetts. So please stay tuned for more information about that. And then the coalition has also been signing on to some of these letters, including some of the efforts to address gun trafficking in Mexico and hold the administration here accountable to some of the promises made. We also just signed on to a letter around the trafficking of arms to Haiti as well. So that's something that we have been doing here at the coalition. We will be getting all of this information out to folks who are here, as well as just a couple of things that are coming up in the upcoming months. We are working with Samaritans to put together a lunch and learn for September around the intersection of guns and suicide. September is Suicide Prevention Awareness Month, so please stay tuned for information about that, as well as wanting to do some work in October, which is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, around the intersection of guns and domestic violence. And John, I want to appreciate, as a former advocate for survivors of domestic and sexual violence, I want to appreciate the fact that you also touched on how guns in Mexico are also being used to harm women around sexual assault and domestic violence too. So thank you for noting that. And I want to finish with gratitude. Gratitude for John for taking the time to educate all of us, to be with us today, and bring us into this important conversation where we are connecting the dots. Appreciation for Giovanna for all the work that you did to put together today's program, as well as to everyone who is here with us today, really in a space of learning and coming together in community and looking at what safety looks like, not just here in Massachusetts, not just here in the United States, but beyond our borders as well. So thank you, everyone, for coming today.